When you walk through the sliding glass doors of a modern hospital or, even just your local clinic, there's this very specific feeling that just washes over. That sharp, that astringent smell of antiseptic. You see the bright fluorescent lights.
Right, the squeak of the rubber shoes on the floor.
Exactly. And in that moment, especially if you're sick or you're in pain, you just sort of instinctively surrender. I mean, you feel like you're stepping into the sanctuary, right?
A very profound psychological shift.
There's this deeply ingrained trust that the people inside that building, the ones in the white coats, are entirely focused on one single, ancient, noble goal: healing you.
We are so conditioned to view medical spaces as insulated from the normal rules of the world. We want to believe the priority is just unequivocally the patient.
Right.
Which kind of echoes these sacred duties from ancient figures, like Acharya Charaka in the Ayurvedic traditions, or even Florence Nightingale. We just assume the whole system is built around this philosophy of care.
But what if you were to pull back the curtain on the actual mechanics of the modern healthcare system? What if you looked at the literal blueprints of how this entire infrastructure was designed and funded and legally structured?
It looks incredibly different when you do that.
It really does. It starts to look and operate and even penalize people like a massive, highly efficient factory floor. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking you on a massive journey today.
It's a huge one.
We're going to unpack a giant stack of sources. We've got historical documentaries on the origins of Big Pharma. We've got rigorous academic papers on hospital infections coming out of Palestine.
And we're also following the deeply personal, decades-long battle of a physician named Dr. Kadiyali Srivatsa.
Right, a doctor who actually took on the medical establishment of the United Kingdom.
The core question we are investigating for you today is, how exactly did healthcare transition from this patient-centered sacred duty into a monopolized, profit-driven corporate machine?
Because that contrast between the art of healing and the business of medicine, that wasn't an accident.
No, not at all. It was an engineered shift.
And the history of that shift is just intense. I mean, just to give you a sense of how aggressively this transition was enforced, our historical sources detail these instances from the mid-1900s where actual SWAT teams and armed police were conducting nighttime raids.
Which is just wild to think about.
Right? And who are they raiding? The homes of elderly women in the United States.
Yeah.
Their crime was literally making herbal teas, sharing traditional botanical remedies, and giving vitamins to their neighbors.
It wasn't a cartel bus.
No. These were traditional healers being criminalized just to protect a newly formed, incredibly powerful medical monopoly.
That image of armed police raiding an herbalist is shocking, but it perfectly illustrates the central thesis we're unpacking today.
So today we're going to explore how this entire system was intentionally designed by these incredibly wealthy industrialists at the turn of the 20th century.
We're also going to break down how this system currently victimizes not just the patients, but the very doctors who actually try to maintain ethical standards.
And maybe most urgently, we need to look at what happens to this massive trillion-dollar global infrastructure when its foundation, which is, our reliance on antibiotics, finally stops working.
Because that clock is ticking.
We're going to connect the historical dots so you can understand exactly how this impacts you the next time you have a fever or a persistent cough and you sit down in a doctor's office.
To understand the room you're sitting in today, we really need to rewind the clock.
Yeah, let's go back to the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
Yeah.
If you lived back then, the medical landscape was just fundamentally different. It was this era of profound medical pluralism.
Right.
What did that actually look like for an average person, though?
Well, it basically looked like a genuine free market of healing. You had an incredibly diverse ecosystem of practitioners.
Like who?
There were holistic healers, eclectic medicine schools, naturopaths, homeopaths, midwives, and what we would call regular or allopathic physicians. They were all just coexisting. And the key here is that patients chose their healer based on a very pragmatic metric, which was results. If you were sick, you went to whoever actually made you feel better.
Let's define allopathic really quickly, because that term gets thrown around a lot, usually as a counterpoint to holistic medicine. What did allopathic medicine actually entail back in, say, 1890?
So allopathy essentially means treating a disease by creating a condition that is antagonistic to the disease.
Okay.
In the 1800s, this often meant very harsh, very physical interventions. If you had a fever, an allopathic doctor might use bloodletting to, quote-unquote, cool the body.
Bloodlettings?
Yeah, or they'd prescribe heavy metals like mercury or arsenic to purge your system.
Which sounds insane now.
It was. These treatments were often incredibly toxic and dangerous. It was a very aggressive approach to the human body.
So if you're a patient in 1890 and the local allopathic doctor wants to bleed you or give you literal mercury and it just makes you violently ill, you had other options, right?
Precisely. You could walk down the street to the herbalist or the eclectic doctor. They might give you a tincture of willow bark for your pain.
And willow bark actually works.
Yeah, it contains salicin, which is the active precursor to aspirin. Or they might give you cinchona bark for a malarial fever, which contains quinine.
Oh, wow.
These botanical and holistic schools were wildly successful. They were graduating hundreds of doctors every year because their remedies were rooted in centuries of observational data. And frankly, they were often much safer and more effective than the aggressive allopathic stuff of the time.
Enter the titans of industry, the men who had already monopolized the physical resources of the world. We were talking about John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate who built Standard Oil, and Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate.
Right, the richest men in the world.
They turn their eyes toward this massive, pluralistic medical landscape, and they see a glaring business problem. The problem is simple. You cannot patent the plant.
You really can't if you view the world through the lens of monopoly capitalism, which Rockefeller certainly did. A decentralized system of herbalists and holistic doctors is an absolute nightmare.
I mean, anybody can grow a plant.
Exactly. Rockefeller had built his immense wealth by crushing competition and controlling every single step of the oil supply chain, from the wells to the refineries to the railroads.
Right.
When his advisors analyzed the healthcare market, they realized that as long as medicine was based on natural botanical substances that anyone could just grow in their backyard or forage in a forest, there was no way to control the supply.
And if you can't control the supply, there's no way to extract a massive centralized profit.
Exactly.
So if you're Rockefeller and you want to corner the healthcare market, you have to fundamentally change what medicine actually is. You need medicine to be based on something you can control.
You need it to be based on synthetic, patentable compounds. And serendipitously for Rockefeller, the burgeoning field of chemistry was figuring out how to synthesize medicinal compounds from petrochemical.
Chemicals derived from oil.
This perfectly aligned with his existing petroleum empire. The goal became clear shift the entire medical paradigm away from unpatentable nature and toward patentable petrochemical-derived pharmaceuticals.
But how on earth do you accomplish that? How do you convince an entire nation to abandon thousands of years of botanical knowledge, especially when those holistic doctors were genuinely helping people?
It's not easy.
You can't just make a law overnight. You have to change the culture. And the sources point out that they did it under the guise of philanthropy.
This is where the strategy becomes incredibly calculated. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation, working in deep alignment with Rockefeller's vision, funded a comprehensive survey of all the medical schools across America.
Okay.
The stated goal was to standardize and elevate medical education. This initiative resulted in the infamous Flexner Report.
Let's talk about the man they chose to lead this monumental, landscape-altering evaluation of medical science, Abraham Flexner.
Oh, this part is wild.
When I first read this in the sources, I had to double-check the facts because it sounds absurd. Abraham Flexner was not a physician. He was not a biological scientist. He was a former school teacher. He had never practiced medicine a single day in his life.
It is a stunning historical detail. They deliberately did not choose a seasoned, eclectic doctor or someone with a track record of actually healing patients.
They chose a guy they could control.
They chose an educator who could be relied upon to apply a very specific, predetermined set of criteria. Flexner toured the country, visiting medical schools. Sometimes he would only spend a few hours at an institution. And crucially, he did not judge these schools based on patient outcomes. He didn't look at whether the doctors graduating from these schools were actually curing people in their communities.
If he wasn't looking at patient health, what was he looking at?
He was evaluating them based on whether they matched a highly specific, laboratory-centric, German-trained allopathic model. To receive a favorable review from Flexner, a medical school needed to have massive, wildly expensive laboratory infrastructure. They needed the latest microscopes, large chemical synthesis labs, and a curriculum entirely focused on the mechanical and chemical intervention of disease.
So he basically set a standard that only heavily funded pharmaceutical-leaning institutions could possibly meet.
Exactly.
If you were a traditional botanical school, you simply didn't need a massive chemical synthesis lab to teach students how to identify and prescribe medicinal plants. But under Flexner's criteria, the lack of that lab made you quote-unquote substandard.
It was a brilliantly designed trap. Once the Flexner report was published in 1910, it essentially condemned the vast majority of medical schools in the country. Following the report's publication, Rockefeller and Carnegie poured massive sums of philanthropic money. We're talking millions of dollars exclusively into the medical schools that adhered to the Flexner model.
They bought the system.
They effectively bought control of the curriculum. The schools that received the money flourished and expanded, while the holistic, eclectic, and homeopathic schools were systematically starved of funding and credibility.
The numbers on this are just absolutely devastating. Let's look at the actual drop-off. In 1910, America had roughly 165 medical schools, representing a wide variety of medical philosophies.
Right.
Between 1910 and 1925, following the Flexner Report and that strategic deployment of industrialist wealth, that number plummeted. In 1910, America had roughly 165 medical schools, representing a wide variety of medical philosophies.
Right.
Between 1910 and 1925, following the Flexner Report and that strategic deployment of industrialist wealth, that number plummeted. Of the alternative and eclectic schools, only 81 remained by 1925.
Half of them gone.
And another historical analysis points out that overall, the total number of medical schools dropped from about 650 down to just 50 by the end of World War I.
The diversity of thought in medicine was essentially eradicated within a single generation.
It's like a billionaire buying up every independent coffee shop, replacing them with a massive corporate chain, and then lobbying the government to make it illegal to brew your own coffee at home.
That's a perfect analogy. And the schools that survived were specifically, exclusively the ones teaching pharmaceutical intervention-based medicine. They were teaching doctors to diagnose a symptom and prescribe a patented pill.
But they didn't just rely on funding to kill off the competition, right? They used the law. Let's look at the Shepherd-Towner Act of 1921.
Yeah, this was a huge blow.
This was a piece of federal legislation that seemed, on the surface, to be about public health funding. But the fine print was a literal death sentence for alternative medicine.
The Shepherd-Towner Act tied federal funding to programs that were staffed exclusively by doctors from those newly accredited Flexner-approved schools.
Oh, wow.
This meant that if you were a highly skilled, holistic doctor who had been delivering babies and treating illnesses successfully in your community for 30 years, you were suddenly locked out of the institutional system.
You couldn't get a job.
Right. You might be grandfathered in, meaning the state would allow you to keep your personal license to practice until you retired or died, but you were legally barred from training new practitioners, and you couldn't be hired by federally funded programs.
So the knowledge was quite literally legislated into extinction.
Exactly. It just died with that generation.
It's a staggering realization. The generational transfer of knowledge was totally severed. And to enforce this newly created monopoly, these interests utilized the American Medical Association, the AMA.
Which is crazy to think about now.
Right. Today, we think of the AMA as the ultimate objective authority on health. But its history in the early 20th century is incredibly aggressive.
The leadership of the AMA during this era is very telling. You have figures like George H. Simmons and Morris Fishbein.
Fishbein is such a wild character in all this.
He really is. He's fascinating. He served as the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, for decades and became the literal face of American medicine. Yet he later testified under oath that he had never practiced medicine a day in his life.
Wait, really? The face of American medicine wasn't a practicing doctor?
Nope. He was a political operator, he was a master of public relations, and basically a builder of monopolies.
How did Fishbein and Simmons consolidate so much power, though?
Well, they turned the AMA into a gatekeeper. They created this thing called the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry. The stated purpose of this council was to evaluate new drugs and issue a seal of approval.
It sounds like consumer protection, to be honest.
It does. If a drug maker paid up and advertised in JAMA, they got the seal. If they didn't, the AMA would destroy them.
And what happened to the practitioners who refused to play ball? The herbalists, the eclectic doctors, the folks who knew that natural remedies actually worked.
The AMA created a specialized propaganda arm called the Bureau of Investigation.
That sounds ominous.
It was. Its sole purpose was to hunt down and discredit non-allopathic practitioners. They utilized newspaper syndicates across the entire country to run coordinated smear campaigns. They labeled traditional healers as quacks, charlatans, and snake oil salesmen. They systematically destroyed the reputations and often the livelihoods of anyone who wasn't prescribing their approved patented drugs.
They just crushed them in the media.
They controlled the media narrative so tightly that over a few decades, the American public was psychologically trained to view natural medicine as primitive and dangerous, and synthetic patented drugs as the only legitimate science.
Which brings us to the philosophical core of what this engineered transition accomplished. We moved from a system where the primary goal was healing, where the practitioner's success was tied to the patient's actual recovery, to a system fundamentally focused on commerce.
Exactly. A system where success is tied to the volume of interventions and the sale of patented products.
And Dr. Kadiyali Srivatsa, the physician whose whistleblowing case we're going to dive into shortly, he frames this beautifully. In his work, particularly referencing concepts from his book Charity, according to Dharma, he outlines what he calls the three villains of modern healthcare.
These are the systemic flaws baked into the architecture of modern medicine.
Let's break those down because they are incredibly relevant to the patient experience today. The first villain Dr. Srivatsa identifies is information asymmetry.
This is a massive one.
Walk us through how information asymmetry functions in a hospital setting.
So information asymmetry is a structural knowledge gap. The entire system is designed so that the doctor, the hospital administrator, and the insurance company hold a complete monopoly on information.
They know everything and you know nothing.
Exactly. The patient is intentionally kept in the dark. The language used is highly complex, the billing codes are opaque, and the underlying mechanisms of the treatments are rarely explained to you.
It's like a foreign language.
It is. The implicit message sent to the patient is basically, the science is too complex for your uneducated mind to grasp, just do what we say. This creates a severe power imbalance. You are no longer an active participant in your own health. You are reduced to a passive recipient of directives.
It's like taking your car to a mechanic who refuses to open the hood while you're there, speaks only in technical jargon about the fuel injection matrix, and then hands you a bill for $5,000.
Right.
You have literally no way to verify if the repair was necessary. And in healthcare, this asymmetry feeds directly into the second villain, which is fear.
Fear is the ultimate tool of compliance. When you're diagnosed with an illness, you are naturally vulnerable, but the modern system often weaponizes that vulnerability.
How so?
It uses the fear of severe complications, the fear of chronic pain, and ultimately the fear of death to shut down your critical thinking. Neurologically, when you are terrified, your amygdala takes over, and your prefrontal cortex, the logical questioning part of your brain, it just shuts down.
You stop asking questions.
You become highly compliant. You surrender your free will and your agency to the perceived authority figure in the white coat.
And that absolute compliance is the necessary soil for the third villain to thrive, which is profit, or the complete commodification of healthcare.
Yeah, that's the end game.
Financial interests, billing quotas, and return on investment ROI supersede the actual welfare of the human being in the bed. Dr. Srivatsa references an ancient concept called prajapalanam, which translates to the sacred duty of service and protection of the people.
It's the idea that a healer's duty is a spiritual and ethical obligation above all else.
Right. But when you replace prajapalanam with ROI, the entire system fractures. The intention fundamentally shifts from curing the underlying illness to monetizing the management of the symptom.
Exactly. It's symptom management as a business model.
Now, I have to pause and push back on this a bit because I want to make sure we aren't painting with too broad a brush here. I understand the critique of profit, but when we talk about the standardizing of medicine, the protocols, the algorithms, the rigid rules, isn't that ultimately about patient safety?
That's a really fair question.
Like, if I go into an emergency room, I want my doctor following a rigorously proven standardized protocol so they don't accidentally give me the wrong dose of a medication or miss a common warning sign. How do we differentiate between a protocol that genuinely protects me and a profit-driven algorithm that just processes me like a widget?
That is the defining tension of modern medical ethics right there. You are absolutely right that baseline safety standards are crucial. Nobody wants to go back to the days of guessing.
Right.
However, the critique here is about what happens when protocols transform from helpful guidelines into rigid, legally mandated algorithms that replace human judgment entirely. Proponents will claim these algorithms represent evidence-based medicine. But in practice, these rigid protocols often force highly trained doctors to act passively.
How so? Can you give an example of how a protocol restricts a doctor?
Well, biology is not black and white. No two human bodies are identical. Every patient presents a unique tapestry of circumstances, their genetics, their environmental exposures, their stress levels, their medical history.
Sure.
Rigid reliance on standardized protocols assumes that a symptom in patient A requires the exact same intervention as that symptom in patient B. It prevents doctors from using their honed clinical intuition.
Their actual experience.
Right, the nuanced observational skills developed over decades of practice. They aren't allowed to treat the actual unique individual sitting in front of them. It shifts the paradigm from the nuanced art of healing to an assembly line of intervention.
And who makes these rules?
That's the kicker. Furthermore, we have to ask who is designing these protocols. Increasingly, they are designed by hospital administrators and insurance actuaries to optimize throughput efficiency and limit legal liability, rather than to maximize the individual health of the patient.
Which brings us to the concept of descaling medicine. Because if the system is just an assembly line of algorithmic protocols, you don't actually need a master craftsman on the line.
You really don't.
You just need someone who can follow the flowchart. Let's look at the United Kingdom's National Health Service, the NHS, and the terrifying reality of this de-skilling process. This is where Dr. Srivatsa's story really takes center stage in our sources.
Yes, his personal experience here is crucial.
Let's establish the timeline. In 2006, the UK government made a significant rule change regarding who could prescribe medication. On paper, to a layperson, it sounded like an efficiency upgrade. They allowed nurses and pharmacists to diagnose illnesses and prescribe drugs.
The bureaucratic justification was predictability, right? Reduce wait times, give patients quicker access to basic medications, and save the NHS money by diverting patients away from more expensive general practitioners.
Makes sense on a spreadsheet.
But you have to look at the reality of medical training to understand the danger of this policy.
Right, let's contrast the training. What is the fundamental difference in diagnostic capability between a doctor and someone who isn't a doctor?
A doctor spends over a decade in intense medical schooling, followed by grueling, supervised clinical rotations. They spend thousands of hours studying pathophysiology, intricate human anatomy, and complex pharmacology.
It's incredibly rigorous.
The core skill of a physician is the ability to form a differential diagnosis. This is the intellectual process of weighing a myriad of possibilities. They are trained to differentiate a common self-limiting symptom from the early, subtle presentation of a life-threatening disease.
Okay, so allowing staff who lack that deep training to diagnose patients.
Exactly. Allowing staff who lack this deep, foundational, decade-long training to diagnose patients and prescribe powerful drugs based solely on flowchart algorithms is a profound de-skilling of the medical profession.
Let's give a concrete example to make this real for people listening. A patient walks into a clinic with a persistent cough.
Perfect example. A patient presents with a cough. A nurse practitioner or a pharmacist following a flowchart algorithm might ask 3 questions. Do you have a fever? How long have you had it? Are you coughing up blood?
Pretty standard question.
Right, and the algorithm says no red flags, likely a viral upper respiratory infection, send them home with cough syrup.
But a seasoned physician does something else.
A seasoned physician doesn't just read the answers to a questionnaire. They listen to the specific timbre of the cough. They look at the pallor of the patient's skin. They use their stethoscope to listen to the microscopic sounds of the alveoli in the lower lobes of the lungs.
Wow.
They might hear a faint crackle that indicates the very early stages of a secondary bacterial pneumonia, something the flowchart completely missed.
And the data on the aftermath of this 2006 rule change is just shocking. It proves exactly what you're talking about. When you give a prescription pad to someone trained to follow a protocol, rather than to deeply investigate a cause, the default action is to just hand out pills.
It absolutely is.
We have statistics here from Pulse magazine, a prominent medical publication in the UK, comparing May 2006 to May 2007, which was the first year after this policy went into effect.
The numbers are staggering.
They really are. Prescriptions for the powerful antibiotic ciprofloxacin jumped 218%.
Over 200%.
Yeah. Prescriptions for the antidepressant paroxetine skyrocketed by 262%. Prescriptions for a diabetes drug called rosiglitazone went up by 235%.
Professor Hugh McGavick, a visiting professor of prescribing science, observed this exact trend and summarized it with brutal honesty.
What did he say?
He stated, quote, "Nurses' knowledge of diagnosis is pathetically poor. Only a country with not enough doctors would go down this cheapy line." And he wasn't insulting the dedication of nurses, to be clear. He was pointing out a structural reality. The nuanced, complex ability to form an accurate differential diagnosis takes years of specific medical training to develop. You cannot shortcut it with software.
And to really show how intentional this de-skilling is, how it's actually baked into the corporate side of medicine, our sources point to an incredible interaction Dr. Srivatsa had in 1994.
This was a pivotal moment for him.
This was way before the NHS rule change. Dr. Srivatsa had proven that a specific spring-loaded intravenous cannula, that's the little tube they put in your vein for an IV, was much easier and safer to use than the standard ones.
Right. Inserting a cannula, especially in someone elderly with fragile veins, is a real physical skill. It takes touch.
So he takes this improved, easier design to a major manufacturer, Vigo Spectramaid, subsidiary of the massive BOC group, and they tell him no. They refused to make it.
And the reason they gave him is fascinating when you look at it historically. They explicitly told him they would not manufacture it because they, quote, "do not want to de-skill doctors."
Wait, they didn't want to de-skill doctors.
Exactly. In 1994, a massive medical device corporation explicitly acknowledged that making a physical procedure too easy, removing the requirement for a doctor to possess and maintain a highly honed, difficult physical skill, was considered a negative thing.
Oh, wow. So they actually valued the doctor's skill back then.
Right. It was an acknowledgement that the mastery of clinical skill was paramount and must be preserved.
But fast forward just a decade or so to the 2000s, and the institutional mindset had completely inverted. The goal was no longer preserving the skill of the physician. The goal became de-skilling the diagnostic process entirely so it could be outsourced to cheaper labor.
Exactly. Why pay a doctor a premium salary to use their brain when you can pay a lesser-trained staff member a fraction of the cost to just click boxes on a screen?
Right. So, facing this total collapse of clinical standards, Dr. Srivatsa does what an ethical doctor is morally obligated to do. In 2009, he blows the whistle.
Which is incredibly brave.
He formally reports these dangerous practices, the overprescription, and the algorithmic failures to the authorities. He expects the system to function properly, to investigate the issues, correct the protocols, and protect the patients.
Which is incredibly brave.
He formally reports these dangerous practices, the overprescription, and the algorithmic failures to the authorities. He expects the system to function properly, to investigate the issues, correct the protocols, and protect the patients.
But that is not how bureaucracies designed to protect their own monopolies operate.
No, it's not.
Instead of fixing the life-threatening problems he identified, the system turned its crosshairs entirely on him.